Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 152, Margarete Maultasch. Also episode 15 of season 8, From the Interregnum to the Golden Bull, 1250 to 1356. The 12-year-old Margarete, Princess of Carinthia and Tyrol, was travelling from her seat near Meran to Innsbruck for her wedding with the 10-year-old Prince Johann of Bohemia. Still and serious she sat, in ceremonial pomp. Her bodice was so tight that she had to be laced into it. Her sleeves of heavy green satin, in the very extreme of fashion, fell to her feet. She wore one of these new jewelled hairnets which an express courier had to bring from Flanders, where they had recently appeared. A heavy necklace sparkled on her bosom, and large rings on her fingers. So she sat, serious and perspiring, weighed down with magnificence, between the peevish, grumbling women. She looked older than her 12 years. Her thick, set body with its short limbs supported a massive, misshapen head. The forehead indeed was clear and candid, the eyes quick and shrewd, penetrating and sagacious, but below the small flat nose, an ape-like mouth thrust forward, its enormous jaws and pendulous underlip. Her copper-coloured hair was coarse, wiry and dull, her skin patchy and of a dull, greyish pallor. That is how the author Leon Feuchtwanger described Margarete, the Countess of Tyrol, who is better known as Margarete Maultasch, the Ugly Duchess. This historical novel, that became a huge bestseller in the 1920s, describes how a bright and ambitious but monstrously ugly woman is crushed by society's habit to judge the inside of a person by its appearance. I still have a copy of this book from the 1980s when I first read it, and on its cover is the same image I used for this episode's artwork. It is the picture painted by Quentin Matsys in 1513 and, according to the National Gallery's catalogue, is called A Grotesque Old Woman. It is not a portrait of Margarete Maultasch, who had died 150 years earlier. The identification of the sitter as Margarete Maultasch goes back to the idea of a postcard seller in Meran in the 1920s. Matsys' picture also made its way into the depiction of the Duchess in Alice in Wonderland, by the way. But it's all hokum. Chroniclers who knew Margarete personally, like Johann von Viktring, either do not mention her appearance at all or call her beautiful, if not extremely beautiful. So, as much as I love Leon Feuchtwanger's novel, which by the way is available in a decent English translation, its premise is simply false. The truth is much more interesting. Her actions to defend her inherited county of Tyrol were the changes that tilted the complex equilibrium between the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs and the House of Luxembourg out of kilter with unpredictable, violent results. So, let's find out why and how and what. But before we start, a quick reminder that the History of the Germans is still advertising free thanks to the generosity of our patrons, and you can become a patron too by signing up on patreon.com/historyofthegermans. And special thanks to Carsten D., Karen H., Matthias G., Matthew G., Douglas S. and Dwayne S., who've already signed up. With that, back to the show. Last week we talked about how Ludwig the Bavarian extracted the Holy Roman Empire from the overlordship of the papacy and made the election by the prince-electors the constituent event that elevated an individual to the throne. Many things had to come together to make that happen, namely a misguided papal policy that created rifts inside the church, and a group of innovative thinkers, including William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua, who could provide the intellectual underpinnings of this new construct of the secular state. But another component was needed to bring about the Kurfürsten and Surenes, and that was the masterful diplomacy of Ludwig and his advisors that kept the fragile domestic politics stable. Domestic politics in the empire were so fragile because power was split amongst three roughly equal-sized blocks. It was, to say it in physics, a three-body problem, a conundrum that had baffled mathematicians since Newton and laymen since the release of the recent Netflix series. Calculating gravitational forces between two objects is apparently quite straightforward, not that I could do it, but once you add a third one, even minor changes in the conditions drive dramatic, often violent outcomes. And the competition in the 14th century between the Habsburgs, the Wittelsbachs and the Luxemburgs was a three-body problem. It was a three-body problem Ludwig of Bavaria had kept in balance for 8 long years, until, in 1330, the 12-year-old Margarete, Princess of Tyrol and Carinthia, called the Maultasch, married Johann Heinrich of Luxembourg, the younger son of King John of Bohemia. Margarete was the only surviving child of Henry, Duke of Carinthia. Now, we've met Henry of Carinthia several times before, but let me just recap his life. Henry had inherited the county of Tyrol from his father. Carinthia, you may remember, had been taken by King Rudolf of Habsburg from King Ottokar of Bohemia, alongside Austria and Styria. Rudolf wanted to give Carinthia to his sons, as he had done with Austria and Styria, but he had faced strong opposition from the princes, so he gave it to his brother-in-law, Henry, the Count of Tyrol, who thereby became Henry of Carinthia. Henry remained a close ally of the Habsburgs until King Wenceslas III of Bohemia was murdered in 1306. Henry happened to be the right man at the right place, i.e., he happened to be in Prague at the time and he happened to have married Wenceslas III's sister. So he was made King of Bohemia, which he remained for about 3 months before the Habsburgs moved on Prague, threw Henry out and elected one of their own as King of Bohemia. And this Habsburg was called King Porridge by the Czechs on account of his sensitive stomach, a stomach that put an end to his reign after another couple of months. And Henry returned as King of Bohemia. This time he lasted 3 years, though that was mostly on paper. Henry was a pretty ineffective ruler, a bit sloppy and a pushover. By 1310 the Bohemians had enough of Henry of Carinthia and petitioned Emperor Henry VII to give them a new king, at which point Henry VII's son, King John of Bohemia, took over. The next couple of years things quietened down for Henry of Carinthia until 1314, when he was dug up as King of Bohemia in inverted commas to provide a vote for Frederick the Handsome. That alliance did not last long, and Henry of Carinthia did what many other territorial princes did during the civil war between Frederick and Ludwig, playing one side against the other two and, most importantly, avoiding getting sucked into the conflict. In the 1320s, he got closer to the Luxembourg camp, and he specifically hoped to marry the famously gorgeous sister of John of Bohemia, Marie. But, in defiance of tradition and etiquette, Marie, aged 16, outright refused to marry the Duke of Carinthia, who was not only older than her grandfather, but had seriously gotten out of shape. After Marie's refusal, John offered him one of his nieces, adding some cash to sweeten the deal, but that bride went to another more promising lord. Things were stretched out until by 1327 Henry finally married Beatrice of Savoy, a distant relative of John of Bohemia. By then, Henry was 62 and, as it turned out, no longer able to produce an heir. And with that, his only surviving child, Margarete, became one of the most desirable heiresses of her day. Henry of Carinthia's lands were of enormous strategic importance. Tyrol and Carinthia controlled many of the Alpine passes, most importantly the Brenner Pass, the by far quickest and most comfortable route across the Alps. A crucial consideration for the Emperor Ludwig, who needed to support the imperial vicars in Lombardy. Tyrol and Carinthia was of even more importance to the Habsburgs, since their lands were still divided between Austria in the east and their Alsatian and Swiss domains in the west. If they could get hold of Tyrol and Carinthia, they could connect their currently still disparate land holdings into one contiguous territory. The Luxembourgs, well, they had no particular natural interest in Tyrol, but that did not mean that they did not want it. Tyrol was by no means the only territory the three powers coveted and clashed over. When Emperor Ludwig granted the Margraviate of Brandenburg to his son, shortly after the Battle of Mühldorf, the Luxembourgs were so irritated they ended their long-standing support for Ludwig's kingship, forcing him into the alliance with the Habsburgs that resulted in Frederick the Handsome becoming co-king. That meant again, it was 2 against 1, Wittelsbach and Habsburg against Luxembourg. All parties knew that outright war was expensive and, in the end, unwinnable. And it was also unnecessary, as long as there were so many principalities in the empire whose current families may die out. So the three parties came to a tacit understanding that each should be left alone to pursue their expansion projects and that Ludwig would basically sign off on whatever the other two could gain. The only one who had to show restraint was Ludwig himself, but then he had already picked up the Margraviate of Brandenburg. The biggest winners of this policy were the Luxembourgs. During the 1330s, John of Bohemia expanded into Silesia, added to the county of Luxembourg, and even managed to bring the Duke of Lower Bavaria, Ludwig's cousin and former godchild, under his control. Meanwhile, John's uncle, the Archbishop Baldwin of Trier, added the Archbishopric of Mainz as well as the bishoprics of Worms and Speyer to his roster. This expansion of Luxembourg power was making Ludwig uncomfortable, and the Habsburgs felt seriously left behind. None of their schemes had worked out so far. Into this already tense situation dropped the announcement that young Margaret was to marry the son of the King John of Bohemia, which meant that if Henry of Carinthia would die without a male heir, Luxembourg would gain control over another strategically important asset. And that prospect became increasingly likely as Henry of Carinthia's health deteriorated and his marriage remained childless. Ludwig sat down with the new head of the House of Habsburg, Albrecht the Lame, and concluded a secret pact. Upon the death of Henry of Carinthia, the emperor will declare the 2 fiefs of Carinthia and Tyrol to be forfeit, would then enfeoff Carinthia and southern Tyrol to the Habsburgs, and keep the rest to himself. Both parties were well aware that this meant the war that they had tried to avoid for so long would finally happen. Whether they gave any thought to Margarete and her feelings on the matter is unknown and also extremely unlikely. Henry of Carinthia died in 1335. Margaret was 17 at that point and her husband, Johann Heinrich of Luxembourg, just 13. The 2 children sent messages to all and sundry informing them of the death of Henry of Carinthia and asked for recognition as the new Duke and Duchess of Carinthia and Tyrol. When they got little to no response, they got nervous. Something was not right. They sent urgent messages to King John of Bohemia asking him to come and protect them. The king responded that he would love to come, but unfortunately he was in Paris, and he had been injured during one of these hundreds of tournaments he took part in. This was no trifle. It was the injury that would ultimately cause him to go blind. In their desperation, the young couple sent their advisor, who also happened to be the main chronicler, Johann von Viktring, to Vienna to ask for help from, guess who? The Dukes of Habsburg. Viktring found Duke Albrecht the Lame somewhat evasive and clearly a bit embarrassed about his presence. Soon thereafter, the Emperor Ludwig arrived in nearby Linz. Viktring went to see him too and asked him for help on behalf of the young ducal couple. Now Ludwig wasn't as cagey as his allies and laid it out to Viktring in no uncertain terms. Carinthia was going to Habsburg and the Tyrol would be divided up. The 2 kids would be given a nice pension and should please quietly exit stage left. Next, the court proceeded to an open field, the imperial standard was raised, and Ludwig formally enfeoffed the Dukes Albrecht and Otto of Habsburg with the Duchy of Carinthia and the southern part of the county of Tyrol. Meanwhile, the oldest son of John of Bohemia, Charles, and some other Luxembourg allies had also arrived in Linz and realized what had happened. They called the Habsburgs scammers, cheaters, and swindlers, but absent an army ready to strike, there was nothing to do. Charles of Bohemia and his allies left, swearing revenge. The war was on. There's a brilliant story that Johann von Wichtring tells himself about the way 14th century politicians thought. Remember, he is Margarete's envoy, representing the legal heirs of Henry of Carinthia, who have just been ripped off by the Habsburgs and the emperor. Still, instead of shouting obscenities and leaving with the Luxembourg party, Wichtring goes before the Habsburg dukes and begs them to treat him and his monastery kindly, meaning leaving him in post and with all his profitable sinecures. They said, sure, if you tell us a bit about how the duchy is run, who is who, what to be careful about, and how to organize the administration. On that latter point, Wichtring responded that once upon a time, the Emperor Tiberius had been asked why he left all these corrupt officials in post. And Tiberius is supposed to have answered that there was once a soldier who had received a wound that refused to heal and was covered in blood-sucking insects. When a caring soul saw that and chased the flies away, the injured soldier got angry. "Why did you do that? This is only going to make it worse. You have now chased away the flies that had already become fat from sucking my blood. Now you have opened the wound for new, hungry flies who will suck out even more blood." The moral of the story: better to leave the current parasites, including himself, in place. In the weeks that followed, Habsburg troops occupied Carinthia, experiencing very little resistance. However, in Tyrol, the local lords rallied around Margarete and her husband and refused the Habsburg and Wittelsbach troops entry. That might possibly have been due to the oath of loyalty they had sworn to Margarete's father. But it is more likely that it was because they believed that it would be easier to enrich themselves in an administration run by minors than in one run by the competent Habsburg dukes, who may not believe in the story about the flies. The Tyrol straddles both sides of the Alps and is a country of deep valleys, ravines and craggy summits, of castles built into the sides of soaring mountains, a place a comparatively small but determined force could easily defend, even against large invading armies. Whilst the Tyrol held out against the attacks, King John of Bohemia raised an army to go after the Habsburgs in their homeland, in Austria. At their first encounter he achieved a significant victory when Duke Otto of Habsburg, called the Merry, fled the battlefield before even the first arrow had been shot. The Habsburg army watched with complete confusion that their commander was making for Vienna, and then followed him at pace. At which point John of Bohemia should have gone after them, but for some inexplicable reason did not. The war continued into next year. This time, Emperor Ludwig himself took the field alongside the Habsburgs. It nearly came to a battle near Landau, but this time it was John who ran away. After that, the King of Bohemia, as so often, became distracted by other chivalric adventures, more exciting than a long and arduous campaign taking one castle or town after another. John of Bohemia made a deal with the Habsburgs. Not a great one, I must say. All he got was that the Habsburgs would pay his expenses and let the young couple keep Tyrol. But they would retain Carinthia. Außer Spesen nix gewesen, as the Germans would say. Margarete was incensed about her father-in-law's betrayal. She gathered her boy husband and her senior lords and vowed never to give up on Carinthia, and then added a few choice words about her useless guardian and protector, as if he cared. Margarete was still an adolescent, but at that time people grew up quickly. Though she had managed to defend Tyrol with the help of her nobles, she had lost Carinthia, effectively more than halving the territory she should have inherited. And she also realized that her alliance with the House of Luxembourg wasn't worth much. If the Habsburgs found a way into Tyrol, the chances were slim that the great chivalric knight John of Bohemia would come to her rescue. And the probability that the Habsburgs would find a way to break the resistance of her vassals was increasing by the late 1330s, thanks to the erratic behavior of her young husband. Johann Heinrich of Luxembourg was clashing with the local aristocracy. He razed one nobleman's castle to the ground for alleged cowardice in the defense of Carinthia. And when the nobles got restless about that, he began fearing conspiracies everywhere. And he did uncover what he believed was such a conspiracy, and he had the ringleaders beheaded and their lands confiscated. So Margarete needed a new supporter if she wanted to defend her lands against the Habsburgs. And using the process of elimination, that defender had to be the Emperor Ludwig IV, the Bavarian. Ludwig's stature had strengthened since his return from Italy. His thoughtful policies that broadly maintained peace in the empire, his support for the cities that increased prosperity, and an unexpected gain of Lower Bavaria after the death of the last duke had, maybe not completely, outweighed his excommunication, but made him the recognized legitimate ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. It was thanks to this general esteem and the perception that he wasn't unduly greedy for land and titles that had allowed him to bring the prince-electors and many of the imperial princes to sign the Declaration of Reims. So Ludwig clearly had the power to defend her, but there were a few problems with the plan. First and foremost, the fact that she was married to Johann Heinrich of Luxembourg. An alliance with Wittelsbach would require some sort of marriage agreement that provide a Wittelsbach the opportunity to ultimately inherit the Tyrol. But Margarete had no daughter to marry off. Nor was there much hope for offspring, given the couple now despised each other. So the person who had to marry was Margarete herself, which means she needed to be divorced first. Divorce in the Middle Ages was possible for two reasons and two reasons only: inability to procreate, namely the husband's impotence, or consanguinity, i.e. the couple being too closely related. Margarete went for option 1 and began to complain loudly that her husband was unable or unwilling to share her bed. As for option 2, being too closely related, well, that applied to literally every member of the princely houses in Europe. However, the question whether or not that led to the annulment of a marriage was entirely in the hands of the church, which in the case of Margarete meant in the hands of the Pope. The chances of a Pope granting an annulment of Margaret's marriage to the son of the Pope's key ally in the empire, in order to marry the son of an excommunicated emperor who denied the authority of the Vicar of Christ, was precisely 0.000000%. Still, if Margarete lets things run as they currently were running, well, she would lose Tyrol to the Habsburgs. It was only a question of time. So, she decided to take it one step at a time, and the most important step was to get rid of Johann Heinrich and his murderous paranoia. In 1341, the young duke had been out hunting near Schloss Tyrol. When he returned home, he found the gates of the castle closed. Angry but not particularly concerned, did he ride to the next castle. Again, nobody opened the gate. For the next several days, the Duke of Carinthia and Count of Tyrol rode from castle to castle, from city to city, but nobody would let him in. Finally, he left the county and sought refuge with the Patriarch of Aquileia. That removed the imminent risk of a loss of Tyrol, but Margarete still needed the protection of the emperor, which meant she needed to marry the emperor's son, Ludwig, the Markgraf of Brandenburg. Margarete asked the Pope for an annulment on the grounds of impotence and consanguinity. The process started, but then Pope Benedict died. A successor was found quite quickly, Clement VI, but he had little time for the petition from the Countess of Tyrol, assuming he had had any interest in supporting it in the first place, which he did not have. Time was rapidly running out. The Emperor Ludwig travelled to Tyrol in 1342 together with his son. He brought with him 3 bishops who had been prepared to declare Margaret divorced. But one fell down a ravine on the journey, and the other 2 got scared and refused to grant the divorce. Plan B was to go back to the Franciscan intellectuals. Marsilius of Padua prepared a document whereby Ludwig granted Margarete her divorce, declaring that the Pope had no business granting divorces, This, Marsilius concluded, was the sole right of the emperor. Now, that went a bit too far even for Ludwig IV. He went with the proposal of William of Ockham, who stated that in special situations, when the interest of the state demanded it, the emperor was able to grant divorces, and that this one was such a case. And so on Shrove Tuesday 1342, Emperor Ludwig IV granted the first civil divorce in the empire, and Margarete, Countess of Tyrol, was able to marry Ludwig, the Markgraf of Brandenburg. This was a scandal of truly epic proportions. Whilst the public opinion in Germany could buy into the theories about the secular state and the independence of the empire from the papacy, the idea that the emperor could override till death us do part, that was a step too far, and Ludwig had not done it for some lofty ambition the whole empire could share in, but solely for his dynastic benefit. And that was when the three-body problem raised its ugly head. In a system of three roughly equal powers, small changes in the conditions could elicit violent reactions. And they did. Margarete's divorce pushed the new Pope Clement VI over the edge. Clement VI was already fed up with the unrepentant excommunicate in Munich, who kept sending negotiators but never moved an inch on his positions. Sometimes he had made proposals that included his resignation, but always in such a way that it remained unacceptable to the papacy. And this civil divorce, that was the last straw. Equally, the Luxemburgs were irate about the treatment of Johann Heinrich. Even Archbishop Balduin of Trier, who had joined the emperor at the Kurverein zu Reims and had developed a good working relationship with him, was turned off. The Habsburgs fearing quite rightly that if Margarete and her new husband would have offspring, they might never get hold of the Tyrol and hence would never be able to link up their territories. Even the princes who normally took only moderate interests in imperial affairs, the Dukes of Saxony, of Brunswick, the Counts of Holstein and the Dukes of Mecklenburg, kept a wary eye on their sovereign. Ludwig doubled down, and when his brother-in-law, the Count of Holland and Hennegau, died, he incorporated that county into his possessions as well. That last move pushed the princes over the edge. They accepted Pope Clement VI's call on the prince-electors to choose a new king of the Romans. First, Clement VI placed a 20-year-old prelate on the seat of the Archbishopric of Mainz, so he had somebody to convene the election. Then he paid some serious bribes to the Duke of Saxony and the Archbishop of Cologne, and that allowed the two Luxembourg electors, Balduin of Trier and John of Bohemia, to elect John's oldest son, Charles, the Markgraf of Moravia, as king. Charles, the fourth ruler carrying the name of the great Charlemagne, would become a towering figure in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. But for the moment he was just an anti-king against an emperor who had ruled more or less successfully for 32 years. Sure, Ludwig had lost a lot of sympathies, but he was by no means an easy target. Charles IV and his allies decided that instead of open warfare, the best course of action was simply to wait and let nature take its course. The emperor was 64 years old. How much longer was he going to hold on? However, Charles did undertake one campaign though. Not against Ludwig himself, but against Margarete in Tyrol. Margarete's new husband, Ludwig the Markgraf of Brandenburg, had been away in Prussia. The bishops of Trient and Bozen and some other nobles had taken against the Wittelsbach regime and had called on Charles to come down. And he did. The forces of the bishops quickly rolled up castles and towns until they reached Schloss Tyrol, the great fortress above the city of Meran, the key to the county. Margarete's advisers suggested for her to either flee or submit to the powerful forces led by the eminently capable Charles. But she refused. For several weeks did her troops hold out in Schloss Tyrol until Ludwig von Brandenburg arrived with a strong army and relieved his wife. Tyrol was again saved from the Luxembourgs. But the Emperor Ludwig was not. On October 11, 1347, the aging but still active emperor died from a stroke during a bear hunt outside Munich. I must admit that before I started this podcast I knew next to nothing about Ludwig IV, the Bavarian. But the more I read about him, the more fascinating I find him. A political and military genius who, if he had been in charge of a large and consolidated kingdom like England or France, he would surely have been remembered in books, plays, and statues. A man who, despite his modest education, embraced some of the most innovative ideas of his time and sheltered those who developed them. We are not completely rid of him, since next time we'll have a look at economic developments during Ludwig's reign, in particular the rise of the cities, specifically the city of Nuremberg. But before we do that, we need to bring the story of Margarete Maultasch to its end. In the years that followed, nobody challenged Margarete and Ludwig's ownership of Tyrol anymore. Margarete had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The girls died in the Black Death, but her son Meinhard grew up to adulthood. Ludwig of Brandenburg died in 1361 and their son Meinhard succeeded him. But Margarete's son lived only for a further 2 years. Once Meinhard had gone and Margaret now beyond childbearing age, it was clear that the Tyrol had to go to someone else. In this last contest, it was the House of Habsburg that won. Margaret named Rudolf of Habsburg, the son of Albrecht the Lame, as her heir. Exhausted by a long life of strife, she retired to Vienna, where she died in 1369. The Tyrol remained part of Austria until 1919, when the part south of the Brenner Pass was annexed by Italy. So that leaves one last question. Why did people believe Margarete was so famously ugly? In part, this seems to have come from her nickname, Maultasch, which means something like mouth bag. This could be a reference to a physical deformity, but it was also used as a term for promiscuous women. The latter explanation is more probable. The church, which regarded her as a bigamist, had issued propaganda, branding her as a harlot, unable to contain her urges. That she had married Ludwig to satisfy her unnatural desires, something Johann Heinrich was unwilling to do. These stories then mushroomed into ever more outlandish tales of unsatiable sexual appetites that rival those about Messalina and Theodora. The twist of the story was, however, the idea that she was monstrously ugly, something that, as I said before, we have no contemporary evidence for, specifically not from the people who had known her personally. It was most likely a combination of her nickname Maultasch and the already brutal propaganda that created this image. And when Matz's painting of an extremely ugly person came up for auction at Christie's in 1920, a smart postcard seller in Meran made copies and sold it as a portrait of Margarete Maultasch. And that is where Leon Feuchtwanger picked up the story to create his tale of the fight between the clever, well-meaning but ugly Margarete Maultasch and the beautiful but vacuous and destructive Agnes of Flavon. I love the book for all the evocative scenes from the 14th century, but I'm afraid the whole of its basic premise is fictional. Margarete was just another one of these women whose political ambitions ran up against the social standards of the time, and since her enemies could not break her militarily or politically, they broke her memory. So as I said, we are still not done with the life and times of Emperor Ludwig IV, the Bavarian. Next time we'll talk about the growth of the great German trading cities, in particular about Nuremberg. And then we probably should have an episode about the blind King John of Bohemia, who has been moving in and out of focus, not just for these last 5 episodes, but he also featured in Season 7 on the Teutonic Knights. And as a sort of a Brit, I need to talk about the coat of arms, the motto of the Prince of Wales, at some point, and that point will have to be soon. I'm however under a bit of time pressure since I will be sailing my boat over to the Baltic for the summer. That means I will have to put the podcast on a bi-weekly schedule. I hope you do not mind too much, and we will see you next time.